George Deere. We'll talk to you about electric vehicles. And take it away, George.
Great. Hi. Thanks. I'll tell you very briefly about myself. My attachment to Portland State University is currently with the Office of Research and Strategic Partnerships. And I've been working in the domain of sustainable mobility, but specifically electric vehicles for the last couple of years. And in the next 30 to 40 minutes, what I'd like to do is give you one person's view of where we stand at the moment and raise with you the question that even when we do everything right, in terms of engineering, in terms of planning, in terms of aligning public policy, will we get the desired change that we want? And I don't think we know the answer to that, so I'm going to give you not an argument against why we're doing what we're doing, but to just simply suggest that doing everything the right way sometimes isn't enough, and you can be the judge of whether that's the case here. Before we jump into the presentation, I want to ask you 2 or 3 questions. How many of you are paying attention to electric vehicles? And it's completely okay if you're not, but how many of you, are kind of into this as an energy management or energy security or transportation initiative? So there's not too many. I'm surprised. That's quite all right, but I should probably at least give you 2 or 3 data points that may put some urgency and some meaning in this. So I want to ask you a rhetorical question. For those of you who are not among the knowing and the attentive, do you have any idea how much money we ship out of Oregon's local economy every year for oil purchases for transportation? Anyone got a guess? Do you think it's more than $1 billion? Raise your hand. Okay. Do you think it's more than $3 billion? $6.2 billion. $6,200 million leaves the Oregon economy not to come back. Well, some of it comes back because a lot of our oil comes from Canada and comes from Alaska. But you also know from being students here that the university is kind of broke, the state of Oregon's broke. There's a great deal of discussion around economic development, and let me tell you, the easiest way to get gold, to harvest money, is to capture the found money that leaves our economy. And I would suggest to you that our dependency on oil makes us weaker every day, every year, and that we are just shipping money out of our economy. Let's generalize this. Let's explode it a little more. If that's a pretty bad number in Oregon, do you have any sense of scale how big it might be at the national level? And without engaging you in the rhetorical exchange, I'll tell you, it approaches $400 billion a year. Not to mention the wars that we fight and the troops that we have. Some people think, there's some estimates that hold that for everything you pay at the pump, currently about $4 a gallon, there's probably about $2.50 of additional cost per gallon that we pay indirectly to have navies in the Straits of Hormuz and other places to protect the flow of oil. So this is the only harsh editorial I will give you today. Whatever you may think about carbon emissions, whatever you may think about global warming and climate change, I would tell you that economically we are injuring ourselves, and in terms of the power of the United States, I'm not making an imperialist pitch that we should be, all powerful, but we become weaker and more vulnerable because of our reliance on oil. And we've had 30 years of market signals to do something differently about it, and we're worse off today than we were in the 1970s. Therefore, a lot of thoughtful people and a lot of public policy is arguing for the electrification of transportation. It's cheaper, it's domestic, it's reliable. There's some problems with that, but it's far less worse, far more promising than to continue to base our mobility on fossil fuels. Now, for those of you who are urban planners, I'll tip the hat to you and indicate and even acknowledge that there's an argument that says, well, listen, just converting from an internal combustion engine vehicle to an electric vehicle is not attending to or addressing the problems of traffic management. That's true. I mean, it's not a pure and perfect solution. But for people who have to depend upon, automobiles, it's a less worse option than continuing to be burning tailpipe emissions. Do you buy that? How many of you would agree with that as a general premise? You can raise your hand. This is an interactive class. And so by inference, those of you who don't agree with it may disagree with it, but I'm not your instructor, so I don't judge you. Okay. So let's jump into it. And again, I'm going to do something that I don't like to do as an instructor, but I'm going to read you a story. Do any of you have a history interest or a history background at all? Okay, good. Two of you. One of my favorite books, my interest is in the intersection between technology, innovation, and leadership. And when I have taught at PSU over the years, one of the books that I use, and I think this is worth writing down, even though you won't need to use it for this course to get credit. This is one of my favorite books because it says so much about the challenges of social and civic and engineering innovation. And John Mackler, you may know this because this guy used to teach at MIT, which, if I remember, is your alma mater. The book is called Men, Machines, and Modern Times. It was written by a guy named Elting Morrison, M-O-R-I-S-O-N. It's a series of lectures he made in 1966, a million years ago. I'll tell you parenthetically that Morrison was the nephew of the guy who built the Panama Canal, a major engineering innovation. So he was very interested in societal goals, engineering excellence, game-changing moments, and the culture and societies and how they adapted to opportunities and change. So bear with me as I give you a quaint and odd little story, and pardon me for reading it to you. The two-paragraph story is about, was based on reflections after World War II about the coastal defense of Britain during the bombings by the Luftwaffe. So in the early days of the last war, and by this he's referring to World War II, when armaments of all kinds were in short supply, the British, I am told, made use of a venerable field piece that had come down to them from previous generations. The honorable past of this light artillery stretched back, in fact, to the Boer War. Now, how many of you know when that was? It's about 100 years ago. In the days of uncertainty after France fell, these guns were hitched to trucks, and they served as useful mobile units. They could move them around in the defense of the coast. But it was felt that the rapidity of fire from these ancient pieces could be improved. And so after trying to master the process of discharging these, they called in a time and motion expert, and he filmed it, and he studied it. And he couldn't understand. He was absolutely perplexed at the firing procedure that they went through as they tried to dispel these guns or fire these guns to hit the target more often. And so eventually, puzzled at this, he ended up and looked and noticed that just before they would fire the guns, that 2 or 3 members of the crew would stand at sharp attention for 2 or 3 moments, and then they'd fire the gun. He couldn't understand, and he asked, finally, an old guy who had been in the Army for many years what they were doing. And he studied the film, and he watched the field procedures, and he said, I got it. They're holding the horses. vestigially, they had been trained from the Boer War in the early 1900s. They had codified, they had hardwired their procedures into firing the gun a certain way that was no longer relevant because the horses weren't even there. And I tell you this story because the challenge that we have with any social or civic innovation is to break away from the vestiges, from the routines, from the comfortable practices that allow us to make our life simple or predictable. And I would submit to you that one of the challenges that we have in trying to transition from an economy, a transportation economy that's based upon petroleum to a different fuel source is that we are very accustomed, and we've got about 100 years of having done this, but the rules have changed. Okay? So we're going to use holding the horses as a metaphor, not for the mechanics, not for the engineering, not for the purity of the policy or the correctness of the urban design, but rather as a problem for why it is that societies have a hard time adjusting. Does that make sense? Can I get a yes? Good. I'll give you another quick example. 2,000 years after the Vatican had been recording, so in such copious ways all the papal dictums and letters of Rome, they finally came up back 10 or 15 years ago with a way to capture all of their encyclicals and putting it on CD. It took 2,000 years to be able to convert to a different medium. A better one that I like is at about the same time the United States Coast Guard finally abandoned the process of listening, being attentive for telegraph communications that would be literally issuing out SOS messages. This wasn't at the time of the Titanic. This was about 10 years ago, probably years after the last telegraph operator had died. But the routine of listening and following those rules and holding those horses, were very much stuck into the practices of society. Now I'm going to go sideways with you with one other academic reference here because that's what this is. PSU is a bastion of higher learning, virtually unmatched by any other institution in the nation. So we have to put a certain academic patina on this. Now, class, that was a joke. I don't know why we're having trouble today. I mean, it's such a joke that I, too, am a PSU grad. So another one of my favorite books is called Thinking in Time. And I'm not going to explain the whole book to you, but it was written by two guys at Harvard named Neustadt and May. And they looked at certain public policy decisions that were made over time by different leaders in addressing certain predicaments. And in particular, they did a very close and considered examination of John Kennedy's treatment of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, Kennedy was a historian, and so he tended to look at events as a stream of occurrences over time rather than a single event occurring in a single moment in time. Does that make sense? That's important because what we're trying to do today with electric vehicles isn't just engineering and installing charging stations or buying, fleets of vehicles. What we're trying to do, I would argue, is to metamorphize our transportation system, to electrify our transportation system, and it is a continuous and ongoing drama and not something that's time frozen in 2011. So thinking in time as a stream of events, just like the flow of a river, is a very good perspective when we're trying to understand the way that societies innovate and cultures change. And their model that they came up with as they looked at Kennedy's successful prosecution of the challenge against both the Cubans and the Soviets was his ability to think in time. And he could compartmentalize facts in three different ways. This could be important. First of all, he had the ability to understand what was known about a situation. And secondly, He had this uncanny ability to look at what was presumed. Now, presumptions and assumptions can be very useful. They can be extremely dangerous. And I would tell you, we Americans are very good at solving problems. We're not always really good about framing problems. You know, we're very impetuous. We love to go on and fix the problem. But sometimes we don't think in time, and sometimes we don't really validate the problem as well as we could. And we use analogies, and we say, well, you know, fighting Libya is just like Iraq, and so we shouldn't do it, or we should do it, or we don't want it to be our next Vietnam. Those are all false analogies. They're powerful, they're meaningful, they're economical, but they're wrong. And so you need to understand when presumptions are governing your actions, that you may be captive to very value-laden and incorrect information. And then the third thing is that Kennedy could do is there were many things that were unclear. Not even presumed, but just unclear, unknown. So I'm going to give you that as a mental model to have 3 columns to think about the challenge of adopting and adjusting and responding to the social and civic innovation of trying to electrify our transportation. And that's the rest of my presentation to you today. Here's what we know to be true. 2011 is the baseline year in which all the new generation of electric vehicles will be coming to market. Have any of you heard of the Nissan Leaf? Good. The Chevy Volt, right? So these are brand new cars just coming to market. And between now and 2012 and 2013, virtually every major manufacturer in the world is going to be bringing to market electric vehicles. And we are lucky because Portland's going to be a launch market for them. We're going to see them before most places do. That's arguably a good thing. I can also tell you what we know today. There's probably about 50 charging stations in the state of Oregon. But if we were to regather here in 6 or 8 months' time, there'd be over 1,000 of them. 1,000 public charging stations in Portland, Salem, Corvallis, Eugene, all the way down to the California border. We will be one of the most wired corridors in the world. So we have both vehicles and the charging infrastructure coming in place. We also know that there's other states where this is occurring, but that Oregon is privileged to be one of the pioneer states. Now, I'm not going to go into this too deeply, but the state of Oregon currently is also providing, as a public policy matter, tax credits to assist people in buying infrastructure and in buying vehicles. And those acronyms stand for the Residential Energy Tax Credit. That's an Oregon credit of $1,500. So if you go buy a Nissan Leaf today, you get a $1,500 tax credit from the state, and the federal government will give you $7,500. So you get $9,000 off the asking price, the retail price of that car. Pretty good. Pretty good. There's some other things that we do to make it easy. We have uniform building codes in the state, so the act of buying that brand new car means that whether you live in Woodburn or in Gladstone, it doesn't matter, because we have the same way, the same process, and a very streamlined process to get you not only your car but your home charging station. That's good. You don't want to buy a car and then have it take 60 days for the charging station permitting to go through. You get what I'm saying? Finally, I can tell you that Oregon in general and Portland in particular are ranked by a number of sources as being very high on readiness, on EV readiness. And I apologize for this very busy little portrayal or scattergram, but if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that, you know, the leading cities, and this is of the top 50 cities in the United States by population, that we're right up there with our brothers and sisters from San Francisco and Seattle and Phoenix and New York, and I think Austin, Texas is in there, and so forth. In some cases, the usual suspects. That's really good. But, you know, you can be ready to cook and still have a disastrous meal that you prepare. You can be ready for your exam and still have a disastrous outcome when the grade comes in. And so I'm simply arguing that the act of being ready is not the same as actually achieving the desired outcome. In fact, I'll tell you the end of the presentation right now. The wild card in all of this is what you do and what you do and what you do and what you do. In short, what we do. Will we adjust to it? Will we accept it? Will we incorporate this into our lives? And in some cases, will we accept some of the compromises that owning an electric vehicle may require of us? For instance, I can't easily go and drive across country in an electric vehicle. The cars typically have a range today around 100 miles if you have a pure battery electric car. And if I drive outside of the range of Oregon, there's not a lot of charging infrastructure across the Great Plains of the United States. So you know, there are today, as being an early mover here, there are going to be some limitations and disadvantages. So here's some questions that have to do not only with electric vehicle readiness, they have to do probably with any kind of societal or civic readiness. And that is, you know, is the state of readiness enough to take us to the promised land? And I'm arguing that it isn't. And if not, can we understand and anticipate some of the things that become either enablers or impediments to change? And then finally, and this one interests me a lot, and I can't prove any of it to you, but just like holding the horses, there's, to what extent does the vestigial cultural aspects of who we are, you know, get in the way and either help shape or constrain adoption, social civic adoption? So we talked about, remember, thinking in time. What's known, what's presumed, what's unclear. So now I'm just trying to give you an example of some presumptions. Remember, these are our friends, the tax credits up here. Well, if you're paying attention to the physical condition of Oregon and the physical condition of the United States, then you would have some reason to believe that we probably can't afford to continue to be giving people tax credits. You know, our friends down in Salem, and I'm not being disrespectful, but they've decided that they can't continue to give you a break on tuition. So your tuition's going to keep going up because the state of Oregon now only pays about 8 or 9% of the general fund, operating funds for the university. That's not how it was when I was your age, when I was a student. They used to pay, you know, you want to know how much I paid for my tuition when I was back in Michigan a million years ago? $600 a year. Here's a presumption: gas prices will rise.
Aww, how sweet.
Gas prices will rise. How many of you believe gas prices will rise? That's a better answer. They'll rise, they'll fall, they'll rise, they'll fall. I'm certain they'll rise. I'll bet on that too. But they're going to be very volatile, up and down and up and down, and they're going to be driven by things that we can't even anticipate. And if they fall, it will completely rip out the legs of the movement toward electric vehicles. It'll do great injury to this promising enterprise that we're embarked upon. Here's one that's worth thinking about. There's a presumption that we are rational and that we will act in our own rational self-interest. How many of you buy that? Okay. There's a presumption that most of our fellow Oregonians think like we do. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I wish that were the case, but we don't think alike, and it's good that we don't, but we've never thought less alike than is currently the case probably. Hell, we don't agree on anything. And the other thing that I hear frequently, either as a direct statement or a sub rosa message, is that if we can't do electric vehicles in Oregon, then we can't do them anywhere. Now let me at least decode for you what's behind that message. And this is mildly interesting. 2 or 3 things. First of all, you would agree with me, I'm pretty sure, that Oregon has an unusually high environmental ethic relative to the rest of the United States, right? Yeah? Good. If you are from here, you might also know, or if you do urban planning stuff here, you probably know that the corridor between Portland down to Eugene contains nearly 70 to 75% of the citizens of our state live within that 100-mile band and about 15 miles of either side of Interstate 5. That's really an advantage when you're talking about electric vehicles with a fairly discrete range. Thank goodness for Senate Bill 100 and our land use laws and so forth. And the other one is that, I'll tell you, you don't care much about it, but I'll tell you this. Electric batteries hate temperature extremes. So even though it's only 58 degrees out, if you were an electric vehicle, you would be digging it today. Contrary-wise, if you were running around in 110 degrees down in Phoenix, you wouldn't be digging it. And if you were living in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the wintertime, you wouldn't be digging it. So here in the Willamette Valley, we have a mild climate, a concentrated population. We have cheap, inordinately cheap power rates because of our hydro contribution to the electrical power portfolio here. So we have lots of advantages, but that's a presumption. For all I know, Houston, Texas will be the leader in it because they have a certain energy perspective. Or your hometown, wherever you're from, maybe. We don't know. Here's one that I hear, and some of you as engineers may want to challenge me on this. There's a presumption that I hear frequently that the price performance of battery technology will continue to improve. And no one's quite as incautious to say, to the same extent that it occurs with Moore's law, where price will double or price will have and performance will double about every 3 years. But there is a presumption that these things are expensive today and they'll be within spitting distance of being affordable pretty soon. And I'm not sure that we really know that yet, but we presume that that's true. I'll give you a couple of other quick ones here. This is interesting. If you were a sociologist or an anthropologist, where do you think, if you owned a car, an electric vehicle, where would you charge it? Help me out, class. This is the interactive part. Where would you charge your car?
I'd like to charge it at my home.
I would like to charge my car at your home, too. Who else? Where else would you charge it?
At work.
At work? That would be a good place. Now, you work at Portland State. Can you charge it here?
I don't know.
That's right. Okay, that's fair enough. Well, here's the point. We're putting in place, I told you, over 1,000 public charging stations, and yet we don't know where people are actually going to charge because we don't have any experience with it yet. And it does make sense that you would charge at work, but how many of you have garages where you live? And of course, many of you don't. In fact, something like, I think, nearly half the people who live here don't have, I don't mean here in this room, but in the Portland region don't have garages. So where are you going to park? Or where are you going to charge up, you know? Wherever you can park. But so it's not clear. That's my point. Let's go on to a couple of others. This is probably really tap dancing deep in the weeds here, but there are 3 kinds of charging levels, like slow, medium, and fast. And this first one is called DC fast charging. You can take a depleted battery off an all-electric car and charge up to about an 80% charge state in about 25 minutes time. So you don't get stranded. If you're driving up to Seattle or down to Salem or something, you can actually charge up at a DC fast charging station and move on, kind of like stopping at the Chevron station or at the convenience store and buying a big gulp, you know, before you know it, you're back on the road. There's a presumption that if we put in enough of those that people will drive all over the place knowing full well that they won't get stranded. probably true, but we don't know that. I'm just trying to beat this into you that you can do everything right based on your best estimate and still not achieve the outcome. Here's what's unclear. Will the electric vehicle marketplace take off? How fast? How much will your battery, if you buy a car and the guts of the car is based upon a big bank of lithium batteries, how will it perform over time? Not in a single driving episode, but over 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. We don't know. We sort of know. We have estimates based on engineering. We have theoretical beliefs about it, but we haven't been doing it, so we don't know. What kind of market will there be for those? We don't know. So here's the deal, ladies and gentlemen. We are facing either a tipping point, you're familiar with that terminology, or possibly a tripping point. You know what? I'll tell you what, if I was running OPEC and I saw all these companies trying to get interested to, get into the electric vehicle business, are electric vehicles a threat to OPEC? Well, it may be. On the other hand, it may give them a longer time to play in the game. I don't know. But I would think probably if I were running OPEC, I would lower gas prices. I would go deflate the EV bubble globally so it couldn't take off. Just as a guerrilla tactic, you could do that. I don't know if they'll do it or not. I keep waiting, paying ever more money at the pump. So we don't know. There's a lot of unclears here. I don't know if we're at a tipping point or a tripping point. I will say, I'll go back to this, I think we are at a tripping point if we don't get off of our oil habit. Because we're worse off today than we were 30 years ago, and if we don't do anything, we'll be a hell of a lot worse off 30 years from now. Take that to the bank. So this is probably the end of my editorials to you. I love the first statement, the status quo is not free. We are often lulled into complacency because we're not willing to leap the chasm to make the change to do something that we really need to do. But the status quo itself is not free. Second thing that's obvious to me is that I'm not a shill for electric vehicles. I'm absolutely convinced, and it's one of the reasons I love living in Portland, Oregon, is that there's no silver bullet that will solve our mobility problems. We have some major mobility problems in this town and in this country and frankly in the world. So you got to have a number of approaches for being able to move people and goods. It's arguably one of the most important things that we can do to be successful as a society. Now, the model that we've used for the last 100 years is based on internal combustion engine cars. And I don't know if any of you are from Southern California or Chicago or Houston or Atlanta or places like that, but you know that traffic congestion is just a killer. And if you hit the roads at the wrong time around Portland, it ain't real pleasant here either. Let me give you something to muse about that's maybe it may happen, it may not. Anyone here from Arizona? Well, I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm going to really dump on your state. It's not because I don't like Arizona. You know what I worry about a lot? Arizona is a water catastrophe waiting to happen. And the proof point on that is Lake Powell and Lake Mead. You guys ever heard of those lakes? The water levels are falling rapidly. One hydrologist we've done some work with is a guy named Tim Barnett at the Scripps Institute in San Diego, and he's predicted in his hydrology models that based on the reduced snowpack in the Colorados, in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, that there's a 50%, a coin toss possibility that both of those lakes could be dry as soon as 2023. And by the way, those are the lakes behind Hoover Dam. that sends a lot of the power into Phoenix and a lot of the power up into Las Vegas and some into Southern California. So dig this. If those lakes go dry and the power goes off, we could be facing a dust bowl that might make the last one look like a picnic. And where do you think people who have to bail out of there are going to go? Where would you go if you were living in Phoenix and the water dried up and they could no longer water the golf courses in Phoenix or send water up into the wells or into the fountains in Las Vegas? God, wouldn't that be a shame? Where would you go then? Or if you were one of our Mexican brothers and sisters and we've already choked their water off, there's no wall high enough, thick enough, or deep enough to stop migration when people are thirsty. Where would you go? That's not a rhetorical question. Where would you go? You might, but that's very contaminated down there. I'll tell you where you'd go, probably. You might come to the Pacific Northwest. This could have enormous consequences for us. You think traffic is bad now? It would be a hell of a lot worse. You might go to New England. There's a lot of water there. The power rates are pretty high. Dig this. You might go to Detroit. Land's cheap. Water's plentiful. It's a good location. I don't know. Now we're back in dealing with presumptions and things that are unclear. But if we don't change the direction that we're going in, we're going to end up where we're headed, folks. So having a portfolio of approaches for you urban planners is great. We have to think powerfully about how we design cities in ways that make it possible to move people about. We have to have probably 20-minute neighborhoods. We have to be able to have a walkable city. We have to have integrated public transit, the likes of which you won't see much better than at the very corner of 6th and Mill, right where we are. And in that regard, you should be very proud of your city and this university. We'll need to be able to bicycle around, and we have to honor the work of our friends at OTREC for all of the research that they do in those multimodal approaches for how you move people in a decent way that makes urban centers work in the 21st century. Because the exclamation point on this are these. There are 6.7 billion people on the planet today. In my lifetime, it could grow as high as 9.3 billion, a 40% uptick just in the next 30 years. Today, half the people on the planet live in cities, and 2/3 will by the time I meet my maker. This has enormous consequences for how we live together and how we organize our cities and how we move about. Now, my conclusions to you are these, finally. I think there's a lesson from the MAX train. And most of you are either too young or you weren't here, but I'm going to give you this as my last parting bit of advice. I talked to you about the fact that I'm more interested in the electrification of transportation than just electric vehicles. When the MAX system came into existence 30 years ago, there was a great and interesting and sometimes troubling debate about it. We took monies that had been programmed and dedicated to build a freeway out to Mount Hood. You guys knew that, right? Can you imagine if we would have followed that strategy and built a freeway out to Mount Hood? Now, it wouldn't have ended up at Timberline Lodge, but it was called the Mount Hood Freeway. It would have gone blasting out into Clackamas County. It would have completely been a game changer. It would have changed the appearance and the interaction of land use and commerce in this area, and in some ways probably made us look more like LA than how we look today. Instead, some courageous people risked success for a different vision of what our city could look like. And they got permission from the Congress to reprogram those monies, build the light rail system, and the debate underneath that was going on is, that's cost too much. Why would you hardwire in a rail system? It's cheaper to just run buses burning number 2 diesel fuel. But some courageous people prevailed, and we built a light rail system, and it worked. And it was good, and it grew bigger, and it became a network. And it was good, and it begat the streetcar system that runs here. And we now manufacture streetcars for other places in the United States. It even begat an electric aerial tram. Then it all ties in together, and it connects into the train station, and it connects into the airport. And it's taken, and this is my point to you, it has taken us 30 years, not merely to do the engineering and construction, it has taken us 30 years to make this part of the culture, to achieve the social adoption that has made it successful here. And so when I think about electric vehicles in context as part of an electrification strategy that will help us get off of oil so that we're not as weak as we're going to be if we don't change, then I do it through the lens of 30 years. And I do it with the aspiration and deep hope that each of you in your own way will be part of it, either to design the system, to engineer the system, to enable the planning, to put in place the right public policies to make this work, because this is our urgent moment. If we don't do this well, we won't be sitting here in a very smug and sanctimonious way saying somehow we're different here in Portland. We're different because we are willing to risk success differently. And whether you stay here or leave, I hope you go forward with that challenge. It is one of the great challenges of our time, and I'm sorry to say and pleased to say that it's on your shoulders. I'm done. I'm exhausted. Now, I want to welcome any questions or rebuttals or clarifications that you might have, and I hope this was a useful way of challenging you. John?
Yeah, thank you, George. We have time for several questions, so please go ahead and remember to use the mics on your desktop.
We'll go to this lady first. Hi.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm wondering if you could clarify the difference in the roles between charging stations and battery swapping.
Sure. And that was Mike, so I don't have to repeat the question. The strategy behind charging is like your cell phone. You know, you can go plug it into any outlet when it's depleted and it'll charge back up. The notion of battery swapping is that you might have to go to the AT&T store and exchange your depleted battery for a new battery. Now, the scale is very different. Of course, you wouldn't do that. You probably wouldn't want to do that with your phone, but with automobiles, there's a company called, I just blanked on it, Better Place. And their strategy is to say, let's trade out the battery pack so you can just pull into a bay, trade it out, and 15 minutes later you don't have to worry about charging it overnight and stuff. It's almost like a subscription basis, and you have an entitlement just to change it. That's a very popular approach in places like Israel, very compact, in Denmark. I think they're doing it with the taxi cabs in Tokyo, and there's probably good headway in Hawaii, very compact areas. The problem that the opponents will level against it are these, that the battery configurations are all proprietary. There's not a standard, so it makes the pieces are not as interoperable as they should be in an idealized world. And the logistics would be daunting. So we don't know, though, because a lot of the business models about whether you charge at a station or charge at a Better Place location, a lot of the business models haven't been perfected yet. I hope I gave you a good cursory answer. Yes, sir.
So With electric vehicles being a prospective replacement for combustion engines, a lot of the highways are funded by the gas tax, and an electric vehicle will completely negate that. And it's been a big question of where that funding will come from. I know there's been talk about a VMT kind of tax, but what kind of alternatives to that would there be, or maybe a tax on a charging station, or just other ideas?
That's a terrific question. I want to, if you weren't aware of it, Oregon is the first state that had introduced the gas tax. So you buy a gallon of gas, you have an embedded fee that helps pay for, the maintenance of roads and bridges and so forth. In the 20th century, that made perfectly good sense. At a certain point, though, if you have an all-battery electric vehicle, you're not buying gas. You're getting a free ride. And so our policymakers up in Olympia and Washington and down in Salem are struggling with that question right now. In Washington, I think they just passed, they haven't signed the bill yet, but I think they passed like $100 a year surcharge or something, which is obviously just a small Band-Aid solution to buy time. The only thing I can tell you are two personal opinions. One of them is I wouldn't attack the problem right now because it's not a problem yet. I mean, if we have 100 or 3,000 electric vehicles running on the road, I'm much more concerned about triple, tractor trailer trucks running, their big loads and cutting ruts into the street than some, generally pretty light vehicle getting a free pass for a year or two. I just wouldn't go after it yet. But I understand the equity arguments. The other thing, though, is it's very obvious, since we have the technology, the policy question is, should you pay for what you consume? So if you have the ability to track the distance people travel on public roads, shouldn't they pay for that? Yes or no? And if you can gauge that, because we can do it with the GPS on our phones, we can figure out how far you travel, then why shouldn't we use that as a fairer way? It's a fairer way to charge people for actual consumption than to charge me and my, Mini Cooper the same thing that you're charging this other guy in a gigantic gas-burning, SUV. My car is much less impactful, but I'm not arguing that that's like some other example I could give you that's too crude, so I won't do it at this time. I don't want to. I'm just saying, though, that we're at the cusp. It's very obvious that the gas tax isn't going to carry us forward, and we haven't either got enough mass experience or courage to do a VMT tax yet. But when it happens, I'll bet you Oregon will be the first state off, or one of the very first. Yes, sir.
So, I just had a question. Have there been any studies or surveys to back up this argument that that it will or that it might be beneficial to do electric vehicles in the future? Have you guys gone through and surveyed people and said, hey, would you switch to this if you're given these resources?
I don't have full command on how much public opinion research has been done. I know that Nissan, which is a leader in it, has done their own market research. I know that we're privileged to participate with Toyota on a demo program with one of their plug-in vehicles. They're collecting data. I know our friends at OTREC have done a lot of interviews and consumer research, but there's not the consummate study that I'm aware of, the landmark study that says this is how consumers feel. We've even done some with a public opinion research firm in town called Davis Hibbets that does a lot of the political research here as well. What we found in that early study is there is a strong tendency of Oregonians that may or may not favor electric vehicles directly, but definitely favor less polluting fuel and propulsion sources, and that do anything that ameliorates carbon seems to resonate with a lot of Oregonians. But we know in the same breath that they don't know very much about the difference between a range-extended Volt and a plug-in hybrid Prius and a battery electric Leaf and so forth.
It seems kind of risky to sit there and implement all this infrastructure and have 5 people use it.
What I didn't tell you is that it is risky. It's risky, but it's free. And it's not free, but the U.S. Department of Energy made a $100 million grant to find out. That's all. And you might go, hell, that's a lot of money. It is. But when you look at the $400 billion and the amount of money we spend on military and stuff, it's a bet that's worth taking, and Oregon's privileged to be one of the guinea pigs, I think. But time will tell. We may look stupid on this. We might find that we've thrown a charging party and no one showed up. You know? But I appreciate the fact that, A, we get a chance to be a leader. We're perceived as a leader, and we have to answer it, because I've lived through the last 30 years where we didn't do a damn thing except ration gas by, odd, even days, and gotten into more wars. So we'll see. But there's behind every problem there's huge amounts of opportunity. That's the opportunity in public policy and urban planning and in engineering and stuff. It's a great opportunity for us. One more question, sir.
Where do you see like hybrid technologies, hybrid cars and stuff coming? Like I'm not really an early adopter, but it seems like where you combine the two technologies, you give people a little bit of a comfort zone, rather than buying an electric car and running out of juice someplace on the freeway.
It's very obvious to me that we're in the hybrid era right now. We see a growing number of not just nameplates, but different kinds of configurations that allow for engines and motors to coexist. And Portland, as you probably know, is thought to be the leader on a per capita basis of Prius, licensed Prius vehicles. I've driven both, and if I were going to buy a new car tomorrow, I would buy a hybrid vehicle. And it's nothing against the battery electric vehicles, but it has more versatility for what I need to be able to do. And there's some very impressive. Look, here's what a hybrid does for you. This is what I figured out. Everyone in this room knows more than I do about engineering and technology, but do you know why a Prius can get 50 miles per gallon when a similarly sized and weighted vehicle only gets 28? Why do you suppose that would be? It's not because it's Japanese. How does that happen? I'll tell you how it happens. Think about the last time you sat behind, whether it was a car with a bad exhaust system or if it was a big honking 10-ton truck at a stop sign or a traffic light. The act of moving dead iron, 2 tons or 10 tons, from a dead stop to about 5 miles an hour, you see this pollution spewing out of the tailpipe, and the vehicle is sitting there going, I don't really want to move, and then finally it gets going. So you know what a Prius does? It electrifies that dead stop to about 4 or 5 miles an hour. And from that, it's able to achieve like a 75 or 80% improvement in fuel economy. So the argument has to be, if batteries are imperfect and people don't buy compressed natural gas and fuel cell cars aren't with us, it almost stands to reason for many applications that hybrid technology is the way to go. And you'll have many more choices in the next 5 years, I'm convinced. We done?
Yeah, I think we've
Been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you. I'd like to put in a plug for our speaker for next week. Our speaker will be Gabe Klein, the former director of the Washington, D.C. Department of Transportation, who will talk about past, present, and future of personal urban transportation. And let's see. For those of you who are in the class, I remind you to write out your questions for the speaker, because I know a lot of you have not had the opportunity to do that, and to hand them in to me right now.
I hope I didn't make any unfair comment. You're the one from Phoenix, right?
Florence. Florence.
No.
Casa Grande.
No. Well,
It's the middle of nowhere. You should
no, I didn't mean to unfairly draw attention to your state. I love Arizona, but it is a catastrophe waiting to happen. So anyway, thanks for your goodwill. Hi.
First, I just wanted to say, when I went to University of Illinois, it only cost me $220.
My wife, yeah. Well, they were a richer state. My wife is from Champaign, Urbana, and went to Illinois. Great school.
Just a comment about the Prius, though. I have one, but Toyota and Honda make lots of other hybrids.
Uh-huh.
But a lot of the Toyota hybrids don't get nearly the improvement that the Prius did.
Yeah.
My view is that it isn't just that 5 miles an hour that all
No,
of them
no.
do. It's